They found him buried alive in a cornfield, his eyes still open, frozen in a final moment of terror. Anthony Spilotro had survived dozens of assassination attempts, had beaten murder charges that should have put him away for life, had built a criminal empire that stretched from Chicago to Las Vegas. But in the end, it wasn't his enemies who got him, it was his friends. The same organization that made him would destroy him. This is the story of Tony the Ant, a man so violent that even the mob considered him too dangerous to live. In 1971, a small man with cold blue eyes stepped off a plane in Las Vegas. He carried no weapons, traveled with no bodyguards, yet within hours, every criminal in the city knew his name. Anthony Spilotro hadn't come to gamble, he'd come to collect. The Chicago outfit had sent their most ruthless enforcer to protect millions of dollars in illegal casino profits, and Tony would do whatever it took to get the job done. For 15 years, he ruled Vegas through fear and violence. Then one day, he simply vanished. What happened to Tony the Ant would become one of the most brutal chapters in mob history. Anthony John Spilotro was born on May 19, 1938 in Chicago, Illinois. He wasn't born into luxury or privilege. His parents, Pasquale and Antoinette Spilotro, were Italian immigrants who ran a small restaurant called Patsy's. Pasquale had crossed the Atlantic in 1914 at the age of 15, arriving from Triggiano in the Bari province of southern Italy. Like many immigrants of that era, he came to America seeking a better life, but what he found was a city divided by ethnic neighborhoods and controlled by organized crime. The family restaurant became a regular hangout for mobsters like Sam Giancana, Jackie, the lackey Cerrone, Gus Alex and Francesco Frank the enforcer Nitti. Imagine being a child helping your mother clear tables while some of the most dangerous men in Chicago discussed murders over pasta. This was Tony's childhood, this was normal. The Spilotro household was crowded and chaotic. Tony was the fourth of 6 sons: Vincent, Victor, Pasquale, Jr., John, Michael and Anthony himself. 5 of these brothers would eventually become involved in criminal activities. Only Pasquale, Jr. managed to escape the pull of the streets, becoming a highly respected oral surgeon in Chicago. Young Tony's first job was shining shoes at the busy intersection of West Grand and North Harlem Avenues. His childhood friend Frank Culotta worked a shoe-shine stand on the other side of the street. As Culotta later recalled, "We argued about staying on each side of our street. As we grew up, we stole together and rode together in hot cars. Think about that for a moment." While other kids were playing baseball or going to the movies, Tony and Frank were already learning the rules of the street. Territory mattered, respect mattered, and if someone crossed you, there had to be consequences. Tony attended Burbank Elementary School and entered Steinmetz High School in 1953, but school couldn't hold his attention. When his father had a stroke and died the next year, Tony dropped out and started a full-time life of crime. He was barely 16 years old, suddenly without a father, watching his mother struggle to keep the family restaurant running. The streets offered him something school never could: power, money, and respect. His first arrest came on January 11, 1955, for attempting to steal a watch from a River Forest store. He was fined just $10 and put on probation. To the authorities, he was just another teenage shoplifter. They had no idea what he would become. By the time he was 21, Spilotro had been arrested 13 times and had earned the trust of Sam "Mad Dog" DeStefano, who was an enforcer for the Chicago outfit. DeStefano was a psychopath even by mob standards, a man who enjoyed torture for its own sake. And he saw something special in young Tony Spilotro: a coldness, a willingness to do whatever was necessary. The year 1962 would change everything for Tony Spilotro. DeStefano assigned him the murders of Billy McCarthy and Jimmy Maraglia, 2 young burglars who had committed crimes near the area in Chicago where mobsters lived. The mob had rules: you didn't steal from mob neighborhoods, you didn't bring heat to mob families. McCarthy and Maraglia had broken these rules. What happened next would become legend in organized crime circles. Spilotro didn't just kill them, he tortured them first. He apparently crushed McCarthy's head in a vice, causing his eyes to pop out of his skull before slitting both their throats. Their maggot-covered bodies were found in the trunk of a car on May 15, 1962. This wasn't just murder, this was a message, and everyone in Chicago's underworld heard it loud and clear. Tony Spilotro wasn't just another street thug. He was an artist of violence, someone who could turn murder into theater, who understood that in the mob, fear was more valuable than money. In 1963, at just 25 years old, Spilotro became a made man in the Chicago outfit. This was incredibly young for such an honor. Most mobsters waited decades for this recognition. But Tony had proven himself in ways that made even hardened killers take notice. At this point, let me paint you a picture of the man himself. Spilotro wasn't physically intimidating. He stood just 5 feet 6 inches tall and weighed about 160 pounds. In a world of tough guys and bruisers, he looked more like an accountant than an enforcer. But there was something in his eyes, a confident, detached gaze, perhaps a little bored with the outside world. Behind those blue eyes, Anthony Spilotro seemed to be committing murder in his mind. The FBI's special agent William Romer gave him his famous nickname when he publicly referred to Spilotro as that little pissant. Since the media couldn't print pissant, they changed it to the ant. The name stuck, but it was misleading. Ants work together in harmony. Tony Spilotro worked alone, even when he was surrounded by others. Through the 1960s, Tony's reputation grew. A series of murders occurred in which the mobster was believed to have participated, but no charges were ever officially made. This was the pattern of his life. Everyone knew what he did, but no one could prove it. Or more accurately, no one who could prove it lived long enough to testify. In 1963, Spilotro stabbed real estate agent Leo Foreman with an ice pick, and then shot him because Foreman had previously thrown DeStefano out of his office. Spilotro had called Foreman to DeStefano's house on the pretext of playing cards. He and the DeStefano brothers were indicted for the murder in 1972, but here's where Tony showed his true cunning. While under trial, Spilotro is thought to have arranged the killing of his one-time mentor DeStefano on April 15, 1973. Think about that. His mentor, the man who brought him into the mob, who taught him the business, Tony had him killed to save himself. In the mob, loyalty only goes so far. Meanwhile, Las Vegas was changing. Beginning in the late 1940s, organized crime had funneled vast amounts of money into secret investments in Las Vegas casinos. The Chicago outfit swept in, taking control of the illegal skim operations, siphoning off casino dollars before they were officially counted and taxed. The early 1970s were a heady time for mobsters, when the mob controlled virtually every casino worth controlling in Las Vegas, and the skim diverted millions into the coffers of the outfit. The outfit placed Frank "Lefty" Rosenthal in charge of the Stardust, with frontman Alan Glick, and they needed someone to protect their interests. By 1971, the Chicago bosses decided they needed someone special in Vegas. They needed an earner and an enforcer. They tapped Tony Spilotro to replace Marshall Cafano as the mob's representative in Las Vegas. It was a promotion that would change everything. When Spilotro arrived in Vegas, he was tasked with managing the outfit's illegal casino profits from 4 major casinos: the Stardust, the Fremont, the Hacienda, and the Marina. He also formed the Hole in the Wall Gang, a burglary crew he created when he moved to Las Vegas in 1971. Let me explain what the skim meant in real terms. Every night before the casino's official count, trusted employees would remove stacks of cash from the counting rooms. This money never appeared on any books, was never taxed, never reported. The Cleveland mob's share alone was $40,000 a month, delivered by courier to Chicago. Mob chiefs from Chicago, Milwaukee, Cleveland, and Kansas City all got their cuts. We're talking about millions of dollars every month, flowing from Vegas to crime families across the Midwest. Frank "Lefty" Rosenthal was put in charge of the Stardust with frontman Alan Glick, and Spilotro's job was to keep Rosenthal happy and the skim operational. On paper, Spilotro ran a gift shop called the Gold Rush. In reality, he was the mob's enforcer, their protector, their message to anyone who might interfere with their operations. Vegas in the 1970s was a different world. The corporations hadn't taken over yet. The FBI wasn't as present. The mob ran the city from the shadows, and Tony Spilotro was their sword and shield. He used intimidation and violence to maintain control and order. His reputation as a fearsome enforcer grew, and he became a feared figure in both Las Vegas and Chicago. But Tony got bored, can you imagine? Here he was, making more money than he'd ever dreamed of, living in the desert paradise of Las Vegas, trusted by the most powerful crime family in America, and he was bored. So he formed a burglary crew that would become known as the Hole in the Wall Gang. The crew got its name from its penchant for drilling through the exterior walls and ceilings of the locations they burgled. They didn't go through doors or windows like common thieves. They came through walls, through ceilings, appearing where no one expected them. In early 1979, Frank Carlotta moved to Las Vegas to join The childhood friends were reunited, now as adults in the criminal big leagues. Together, they ran the hole-in-the-wall gang like a military operation. They had lookouts, drivers, safe crackers, and fence operations to move the stolen goods. On July 4, 1981, the gang robbed Bertha's gifts and home furnishings. The robbery was a bust as much of the gang was arrested, including Carlotta and several others, each charged with burglary, conspiracy to commit burglary, attempted grand larceny, and possession of burglary tools. This arrest was a turning point, though no one knew it at the time. The FBI had been watching Spilotro for years, building their case, waiting for the right moment. The Bertha's robbery gave them the leverage they needed. They approached the arrested gang members one by one, looking for someone to flip. But there was another problem developing, one that had nothing to do with law enforcement. Around this time, Spilotro had an affair with Jerry McGee, the wife of Frank "Lefty" Rosenthal. In the mob, there were rules. You didn't sleep with another made man's wife. You especially didn't sleep with the wife of the man running the skim operation that was making everyone rich. Jerry McGee wasn't just any mob wife. She was a former showgirl, beautiful and troubled, with a history of drug abuse and bad decisions. The FBI described her as a long-time known prostitute in Las Vegas. She would later die from a drug overdose in Los Angeles in 1982. But for a time, she was the center of a triangle that would help bring down the mob's empire in Vegas. Think about the psychology here. Tony Spilotro could have had any woman in Las Vegas. But he chose the one woman he absolutely couldn't have. Was it the danger that attracted him? Was it a power play against Rosenthal? Or was he just so used to taking whatever he wanted that he couldn't imagine consequences? In 1982, Spilotro allegedly tried to car-bomb Rosenthal. The attack failed, but the repercussions of his affair with Rosenthal's wife continued to upset the Vegas mob. This incident, together with Spilotro's other misdeeds, was catching up to him. The car bombing was sloppy, amateur hour by Spilotro's standards. Rosenthal survived, though he probably wished he hadn't. His car exploded, but the steel plate under the driver's seat saved his life. He staggered from the burning wreckage, his clothes on fire, his world literally and figuratively blown apart. Since he was a made man at 25, Spilotro had caught the eye of law enforcement. Naturally, too much attention on the mob spelled danger, which meant Spilotro was becoming a major liability. The bosses back in Chicago were getting nervous. The whole point of the Vegas operation was to make money quietly. Tony was making noise. Spilotro was arrested again in 1981 after cops caught the hole-in-the-wall gang trying to rob a home goods store in Vegas. Having Spilotro's name emblazoned across the news once again didn't sit well with the Chicago outfit. FBI agent William Romer told the press that Spilotro wasn't doing his job in Las Vegas. He maintained too high a profile there. Mobsters flourish in darkness, and Tony was standing in the spotlight, practically daring the authorities to come after him. In 1982, Carlotta was imprisoned and approached by the FBI with a wiretap of Spilotro talking with someone about having to clean our dirty laundry, which Carlotta took as an insinuation that Spilotro was planning to have him killed. The man who had been Tony's friend since childhood, who had followed him to Vegas, who had committed crimes with him for decades, suddenly realized that in Tony's world, everyone was expendable. Frank Carlotta made a decision that would have been unthinkable just years earlier. He flipped. He became a government witness. At a trial in October 1983, Carlotta admitted that he was involved in over 300 crimes, including 4 murders. He also testified that Spilotro ordered him to make a phone call that lured one of the 1962 murder victims, William McCarthy, to a fast food restaurant. The trial was a sensation. Here was a made man's closest associate, testifying in open court about murders, robberies, and the inner workings of the mob. But incredibly, Spilotro was acquitted. His defense attorney was future Las Vegas Mayor Oscar Goodman, who painted Carlotta as a liar trying to save his own skin. But the damage was done. Even though Tony beat the charges, everyone now knew the FBI was closing in. The heat was unbearable. Throughout the 1980s, Anthony Spilotro faced a series of legal challenges, including multiple indictments on charges ranging from murder to racketeering. The increased pressure from law enforcement and internal strife within the Chicago outfit about his handling of affairs in Las Vegas led to his diminishing influence. The Spilotro brothers' fate had been sealed in January 1986. Most of the upper echelon of the outfit attended a meeting that month at the Czech Lodge in North Riverside, Illinois. This wasn't a regular meeting. This was a council of war. At the meeting, outfit boss Tony, Joe Batters, Accardo appointed Samuel Carlisi as the street boss in charge of outfit operations. Carlisi told the group that Accardo would stay on as consigliere and would have the final say. The old man, Accardo, had run the outfit for decades. He was perhaps the only mob boss to die of natural causes, free and wealthy, and he had had enough of Tony Spilotro. Carlisi went on to the first problem. Spilotro and how things had gone down since he took over Vegas. Mobster Rocco Infelis said simply, "Hit him." Everyone else at the meeting agreed. Think about what this meant. These were men who had known Tony for years, who had made millions from his work in Vegas, who had attended weddings and funerals with him. And they all agreed without hesitation that he had to die. In the mob, yesterday's hero is today's liability. The setup was elegant in its simplicity. Tony and his brother Michael were told that Michael would be inducted as a made member of the outfit. They were to come to a meeting at a house in Bensonville, Illinois. When Tony entered the basement and realized what was about to occur, he asked if he could say a prayer. Imagine that moment. Tony Spilotro, who had killed without mercy, who had tortured men to death, suddenly facing his own end and asking for one final prayer. Did he pray for forgiveness, for his family? Or was he simply buying time, looking for one last angle, one last escape? Frank Culotta and the rest of Spilotro's crew met with the Spilotros in an Illinois location, where Culotta caved in Spilotro's forehead with a baseball bat. The two brothers were savagely beaten with bats before being buried alive. But wait, there's another version of the story. According to later testimony, the brothers were actually killed in a Bensonville basement, then transporting to the cornfield. The truth is, it doesn't matter which version is correct. What matters is that Tony Spilotro, the man who had ruled through fear for so long, died in terror. On June 14, 1986, Anthony and Michael Spilotro disappeared. Their bodies were later discovered buried in a cornfield in Enos, Indiana. Autopsies revealed that both brothers had been severely beaten, presumably as a message from the mob over perceived disloyalty. The farmer who found them said the smell led him to the bodies. Two men who had worn expensive suits, who had driven luxury cars, who had lived like kings in Las Vegas, were found rotting in an Indiana cornfield, buried in their underwear. The mob always did have a sense of irony. By the time of his death in 1986, the FBI suspected Spilotro was involved in 22 or 25 murders, 25 lives ended by one man. Think about that, 25 families destroyed, 25 sets of parents, siblings, children left to wonder why. But Tony left behind a family too. He was survived by his wife Nancy and son Vincent. Vincent would later say, "I just want people to understand that he wasn't this monster." But how do you reconcile the father who tucked you in at night with the killer who crushed men's heads in vices? The aftermath was swift and brutal. On April 25, 2005, 14 members of the Chicago outfit were indicted for 18 murders, including the Spilotros. Nicholas Calabrese pleaded guilty to taking part in the conspiracy and became a key witness, admitting he took part in planning or carrying out 14 of the murders, including the Spilotro killings. James Marcello was found guilty by a federal jury of the murders of both Spilotro brothers on September 27, 2007. On February 5, 2009, he was sentenced to life in prison. The Vegas that Tony Spilotro knew is gone now. The mob-run casinos have been replaced by corporate giants. The skim has been replaced by stockholder dividends. The backroom deals and midnight burials have given way to board meetings and quarterly reports. As author Nicholas Pileggi said, casino is really about the end of the mob in Las Vegas and the taking over of Las Vegas by corporate interests. Spilotro's life story was immortalized in the 1995 film Casino, where Joe Pesci played the character of Nicky Santoro, based on Tony. His career is often cited as a stark example of the violent life and inevitable downfall that many mobsters face, but movies can't capture the reality of what Tony Spilotro was. They can't show the mundane evil of it all, the daily extortions, the casual violence, the families destroyed not in dramatic shootouts but in quiet disappearances. They can't show the fear that an entire city lived under, the legitimate businessmen who paid protection money, the casino employees who looked the other way, the police officers who took bribes to ignore what everyone knew was happening. Tony Spilotro represented something unique in American crime. He wasn't a romantic figure like some mobsters are portrayed. He wasn't a businessman who happened to be a criminal. He was violence personified, a man who seemed to enjoy the brutality as much as the money it brought him. And yet, there was something almost inevitable about his story. The mob created Tony Spilotro, shaped him, used him, and then destroyed him when he became inconvenient. He was both the perfect mobster and everything wrong with organized crime, too violent, too visible, too uncontrolled. The morning after Tony Spilotro's body was discovered in that Indiana cornfield, Nancy Spilotro became a widow. She had married Tony in 1960, when she was a petite local waitress who worked in a mob hangout. 26 years later, she was left to explain to their adopted son Vincent why his father would never come home again. But let's go back to understand who Nancy Stewart Spilotro really was. She was a petty local waitress who worked in a local mob hangout when she caught Tony's eye. Think about what it meant to marry Anthony Spilotro in 1960. This wasn't marrying a businessman who happened to have some questionable associates. This was marrying into a world where violence was currency, where your husband might leave for work in the morning and never come back, where FBI surveillance was as common as morning coffee. They adopted Vincent in 1966, when Tony was already deeply embedded in the Chicago outfit's operations. Here was a man who had tortured and killed, who ran illegal operations, who lived every day one step ahead of either prison or death, and he wanted to be a father. The contradiction is staggering. How do you reconcile the killer with the man who wanted to raise a child? Family videos show Tony Ant as Tony Santa at family parties, including Vincent's birthdays as a boy. On family trips to Disneyland, even a budding outfit boss waited in line. These weren't staged photos for the authorities. These were genuine family moments, a mobster standing in line at the Matterhorn, a killer helping his son blow out birthday candles. Vincent Spilotro would later struggle with this duality. "I just want people to understand that he wasn't this monster," he told reporters. "I just wanted it to come out that he was a man, he did have family, just the human side of him, just tell the truth about it. Even if you're going to tell something bad, tell the truth about it. You know what I mean, you don't have to make up a whole bunch of stuff. I mean, I take this home with me every night. I mean, I've been taking this home for 20 years, Vincent revealed in an interview. 20 years of carrying the weight of his father's crimes, 20 years of trying to reconcile the man who tucked him in at night with the monster described in newspapers and movies. There's a particularly revealing exchange between Vincent and a reporter about his father's intentions for him. When asked if his father saw him as someone who would eventually replace him, Vincent replied, "No, not at all. Here's what happened. In the beginning he didn't, it was all school, you have to do this, you have to do that. In the end he had quadruple bypass, he was getting tired, he was sharing more. I don't know if that's grooming me, but it was still school, school, school." Tony Spilotro, the mob enforcer, wanted his son to focus on education. The man who dropped out of high school after his father's death insisted his own son stay in school. Was this hypocrisy, redemption, or simply a father wanting better for his child than he had for himself? But the Spilotro family's domestic life was far from normal. Vincent helped design a security room in their house when he was just 18 years old. There was a steel door which was covered with wallpaper, you never knew it was steel, a solid door with the frame. The walls were all insulated with concrete and stuff. I mean, you couldn't get in that room. Imagine being a teenager and helping your father build a panic room. While other kids were picking college dorms, Vincent was helping fortify his family home against potential assassins. This was the reality of being Anthony Spilotro's son: constant vigilance, constant fear, constant preparation for violence that might come at any moment. Nancy Spilotro, like most mafia wives prior to the reality TV era, kept a pretty low profile. But there was one incident that showed she wasn't just a passive observer in her husband's world. In September 1980, Jerry McGee Rosenthal, the wife of Frank "Lefty" Rosenthal, showed up at the Rosenthal home high on drugs and alcohol. Nancy Spilotro arrived in a blue Oldsmobile with Utah license plates and ended up wrestling her friend Jerry Rosenthal to the ground, and with police officers helping, retrieved the handgun. Think about this scene. Nancy Spilotro, the mob wife who supposedly stayed out of the business, physically wrestling another woman for a gun while police watched. She wasn't there as Tony's wife, she was there as Jerry's friend trying to prevent a tragedy. It shows a woman who could handle herself in crisis, who understood the violent world she inhabited, who could act decisively when needed. The affair between Tony and Jerry McGee was an open secret in Las Vegas. During the 1980s, Spilotro had an affair with Frank Rosenthal's wife Jerry McGee, which damaged their friendship severely. This wasn't just infidelity, it was a betrayal of the highest order in the mob world. You didn't sleep with another made man's wife, especially not the wife of the man running the skim operation that was making everyone millions. Jerry McGee herself was a tragic figure. She did not live long enough to witness the changes in Las Vegas. In 1980, police in Los Angeles arrested her for trying to undress on Sunset Boulevard. She had been drinking and taking drugs. She was admitted to the psychiatric ward of Harbor General Hospital in Torrance, California. Frank Rosenthal flew to Torrance. When I got to the hospital, I went into her room and she was in a straitjacket, he says. She wanted me to loosen it, but I said I couldn't do that. She started screaming at me. She was hysterical. This was the woman Tony Spilotro had risked everything for, a woman destroyed by drugs, alcohol, and the violent world she inhabited. The human cost of Tony Spilotro's life extended far beyond his immediate family. Michael Spilotro and his brother Anthony disappeared on June 14, 1986, after they drove away together from Michael's Oak Park home. Michael's wife Anne reported both brothers missing on June 16. Anne Spilotro spent 2 days not knowing if her husband was dead or alive. 2 days of waiting by the phone, of jumping at every car door, of trying to maintain normalcy for her children while knowing that in their world, missing usually meant dead. Michael Peter Mickey Spilotro was born on September 12, 1944, and was the younger brother of Anthony. He had 5 brothers: Vincent, Victor, Pasquale, Pat, J.R., Tony, and John. Michael wasn't supposed to be in the mob life. His lifelong friend Larry Manetti said, "I didn't know Michael was a gangster. I knew him as a guy I grew up with in the neighborhood. Michael wanted to be on TV, that's all. Who wouldn't? He wasn't trying to be a movie star or an actor, he was having fun." But Michael got pulled into his brother's world. He became involved in bookmaking, drug dealing, prostitution, robbery, and extortion. The younger brother, who just wanted to be on TV, ended up buried in his underwear in a cornfield, beaten to death alongside the brother he had followed into darkness. The brutality of their deaths shocked even hardened investigators. Their bodies were found, one on top of the other and stripped down to their undershorts, buried in a cornfield. An autopsy identified their cause of death by blunt force trauma. They were identified by dental charts supplied by their dentist brother, Patrick Spilotro. The two were buried in a family plot at Queen of Heaven Cemetery in Hillside, Illinois on June 27. Patrick Spilotro, the dentist, the one brother who had escaped the criminal life, had to identify his brother's bodies through dental records because they were beaten beyond recognition. Imagine that phone call. Imagine being asked to confirm that these destroyed bodies were once your brothers, the boys you grew up with, played with, ate family dinners with. After the deaths of Spilotro and Michael, Victor would be inducted into the Chicago outfit a year later in 1987. The remaining brother, Patrick Pasquale Jr., became a dentist. Even in death, Tony's influence pulled another brother into the organization that had killed him. The revelation of how they actually died made it even worse. According to mobster Nicholas Calabrese's testimony, the brothers were killed in a Bensenville, Illinois basement, where the Spilotros had been led to believe Michael would be inducted into the outfit. Then their bodies were transported to the cornfield and buried. They thought they were going to a celebration. Michael believed he was about to become a made man, following in his brother's footsteps. Instead, they walked into their own execution. According to court testimony, Tony realized in the Bensenville basement what was about to happen to him and asked, "Can I say a prayer?" When Tony realized what fate was really in store for him in that basement, he asked for a moment to say a prayer. The request was granted, and Tony, the ant, apparently used his last breaths to pray for his wife and son. In his final moments, the man who had shown no mercy to his victims asked for mercy himself. Not for his life, he knew that was over, but for a moment to pray. And according to witnesses, he prayed not for himself, but for Nancy and Vincent. The killer, the torturer, the man who had crushed skulls in vices, spent his last moments thinking of his family. The aftermath was a cascade of prosecutions and revelations. On April 25, 2005, 14 members of the Chicago outfit were indicted for 18 murders, including the Spilotros. In September 2007, Frank Calabrese, SR, and 4 other men were convicted of mob-related crimes. On September 27, 2007, Marcello was found guilty in the murders of both Spilotro brothers. On February 5, 2009, Marcello was sentenced to life imprisonment for the Spilotro murders. Justice, such as it was, came 23 years after the murders. 23 years during which Nancy Spilotro raised their son alone, during which she had to answer questions about who his father really was, during which she lived with the knowledge of how brutally her husband had died. When museum plans were unveiled, Tony Spilotro's reclusive widow Nancy was also in attendance. Their family treasures would be on display, with some from Chicago boss Sam Giancana and Vegas founder Bugsy Siegel. After decades of silence, Nancy was ready to let the public see pieces of their life, to show that there was more to their story than just violence and crime. Vincent said, I just like to tell everybody that he's just a man that grew up, raised a family and got caught up in some things that maybe he shouldn't have, but he lived it the way he lived it. It's a son's attempt to humanize a father that history has demonized, not to excuse but to explain, not to forgive but to understand. The psychological complexity of these relationships is staggering. How does Nancy Spilotro mourn a husband who was a killer? How does she explain to people that the man who tortured victims was also the man who waited in line at Disneyland with his son? How does she reconcile the Tony who played Santa at Christmas with the Tony who murdered people for money? And what about the victims' families? While Vincent Spilotro struggles with his father's legacy, there are dozens of other families who lost fathers, sons, brothers to Tony's violence. Outfit investigators put the number of his victims at between 12 and 20. That's potentially 20 families destroyed, 20 sets of children who grew up without fathers, 20 widows who never got justice. The FBI suspected Tony was involved in 22 or 25 murders. Each of those numbers represents a human being with their own story, their own family, their own dreams that were ended by Anthony Spilotro. Billy McCarthy and Jimmy Miraglia, whose eyes were popped out of their skulls. Leo Foreman stabbed with an ice pick and then shot. Sam DeStefano, Tony's own mentor, killed to save Tony from prosecution. And what about Frank Carlotta, Tony's childhood friend, his partner in crime from their Shushin days, the man who followed him to Vegas and helped run the Hole in the Wall gang? When Carlotta believed Tony was planning to kill him, he flipped and became a government witness. He testified against his oldest friend, helped send other mobsters to prison, and lived the rest of his life in witness protection. Carlotta's betrayal or survival, depending on your perspective, shows another human cost of Tony's life. Friendships that should have lasted lifetimes were destroyed by paranoia and violence. Trust became impossible when anyone might be wearing a wire, when your best friend might kill you to save himself, when loyalty was always conditional. The mob's violence created concentric circles of damage. At the center were the direct victims, those killed, tortured, extorted. The next ring held their families, forever changed by loss. Then came the perpetrators' families like Nancy and Vincent Spilotro, living with shame and fear and complicated grief. And finally, the community itself, corrupted and terrorized by organized crime's presence. Las Vegas in the 1970s and early 1980s was a city held hostage by men like Tony Spilotro. Legitimate businessmen paid protection money, casino employees skimmed profits, police officers took bribes, judges fixed cases. The entire civic structure was corrupted by mob influence, and Tony was one of the chief enforcers of that corruption. Tony took the alias Tony Stewart and took over the gift shop at the Circus Hotel. He later sold the hotel for $700,000, $10 times his original investment, in 1974. On paper, he was a successful businessman. In reality, he was a parasite, feeding off the legitimate economy, using violence to maintain his position. But here's what's often forgotten: Tony Spilotro was once a child himself. He grew up in that restaurant in Chicago, watching mobsters come and go, absorbing their values and their violence. He became a neighborhood bully with a reputation for fighting at an early age. In 1954, his father died suddenly, leaving his mother to raise their 6 sons. That same year, he dropped out of Steinmetz High School when he was a sophomore. A 16-year-old boy loses his father and drops out of school to help support his family. In another neighborhood, with different influences, Tony Spilotro might have become anything. But in that time and place, with those role models, he became what he became. This doesn't excuse his crimes, but it does complicate our understanding of them. The cycle of violence that created Tony Spilotro continued after his death. His brother Victor joined the outfit after Tony and Michael were murdered. The organization that killed 2 brothers for becoming liabilities immediately recruited a third. The machine of organized crime kept grinding, consuming families generation after generation. And what of Chicago itself, the city that created the outfit that sent Tony Spilotro to Las Vegas, that ordered his death when he became inconvenient? The neighborhoods where Tony grew up are still there, though changed. Patsy's restaurant is long gone. The street corners where Tony and Frank Carlotta ran their Shushin stands have been redeveloped. But the poverty and limited opportunities that pushed young men into crime, those persist. The Chicago outfit that Tony served so faithfully and that ultimately killed him has been decimated by prosecutions, though not eliminated. The family secrets trial that convicted his killers also exposed the inner workings of the organization, leading to more arrests, more convictions, more families destroyed by the violence that Tony helped perpetuate. In Las Vegas, the transformation has been even more dramatic. By the late 1980s, with population growth and a boom in corporate mega-resorts, Las Vegas was not the same as when Rosenthal and Spilotro were the subject of news stories in town. The mob-run casinos have been replaced by corporate giants, the skim has been replaced by stockholder reports, the backroom beatings have been replaced by legal departments and human resources. But the ghost of Tony Spilotro still haunts the city. Every true crime tour stops at the sites of his crimes. Every documentary about Vegas history includes his story. He has become part of the city's mythology, the real-life mobster who inspired Joe Pesci's terrifying performance in Casino. Several incidents from his life found their way into the 1995 Martin Scorsese mafia film, Casino, like crushing his victim's head in a vice, his affair with Jerry McGee, his ban from Vegas casinos. The film focuses primarily on the Las Vegas crime careers of Spilotro, played by Joe Pesci, and Rosenthal, played by Robert De Niro. The movie made Tony Spilotro famous in a way he never was in life. Millions of people who never heard of him while he was alive now know his story, or at least Hollywood's version of it. Joe Pesci's performance is terrifying and magnetic, capturing Tony's violence but perhaps missing his complexity. Because here's what the movies can't capture: the banality of evil. Tony Spilotro wasn't a movie villain, dramatically evil in every scene. He was a man who went to his son's birthday parties, who stood in line at Disneyland, who had quadruple bypass surgery and worried about his health. He was human, terribly and completely human, which makes his crimes more horrifying, not less. The founder of the Mob Experience Museum says he isn't setting out to glorify the Chicago outfit. He says that showing the living contradictions that were Chicago mob bosses is aimed at giving the public new insight about a significant American criminal group. This is the challenge of telling Tony Spilotro's story. How do you present the truth without glorifying the violence? How do you humanize without excusing? How do you help people understand without making them sympathize with a killer? The answer lies in remembering all the victims. Not just the people Tony killed, but everyone damaged by his life and death. Nancy Spilotro, raising a son alone while dealing with her husband's violent legacy. Vincent Spilotro, carrying the weight of his father's crimes for decades. Anne Spilotro, whose husband Michael was killed just for being Tony's brother. The families of Tony's victims who never got justice while he lived. And we must remember the survivors who have to live with what they did. Frank Carlotta, who betrayed his oldest friend and spent the rest of his life looking over his shoulder. The various mob associates who participated in or witnessed violence they can never forget. The FBI agents who spent years trying to stop Tony, only to see him killed by his own organization. The prosecutors who worked to bring his killers to justice decades after the crime. The story of Anthony "Tony the Ant" Spilotro is ultimately a tragedy, not because a violent criminal met a violent end. There's a certain justice in that. The tragedy is in all the wasted potential, all the destroyed lives, all the grief that radiates out from every act of violence like ripples in a pool. Tony Spilotro was intelligent enough to run complex criminal operations, charismatic enough to inspire loyalty, strategic enough to evade law enforcement for years. In a different life, those talents might have built something instead of destroying, but he chose violence again and again until violence chose him. Standing at his grave in Queen of Heaven's Cemetery in Hillside, Illinois, you wouldn't know you were looking at the final resting place of one of America's most notorious mobsters. He was buried in a family plot on June 27, just another headstone among thousands. No epitaph explains who he was or what he did. No marker warns of the violence he committed or suffered, but perhaps that's appropriate. In death, Anthony Spilotro is finally what he never was in life: quiet, unnoticed, harmless. The man who ruled through fear now inspires only historical curiosity. The enforcer who made grown men tremble is now just a name on a stone, a cautionary tale, a reminder of the price of choosing violence. Vincent Spilotro still lives with his father's legacy. Nancy Spilotro maintained her silence for decades before finally allowing some family items to be displayed in a museum. The victims' families continue their lives, forever marked by Tony's violence. The FBI agents and prosecutors who pursued him have mostly retired, their careers defined in part by their pursuit of the ant. And Las Vegas, the city that Tony Spilotro once ruled through fear, has moved on. The casinos where he collected the skim have been demolished and rebuilt. The streets where he conducted his business have been repaved and renamed. The desert where he buried bodies has been developed into suburbs. But beneath the fresh paint and new construction, the history remains. Every city has its ghosts, and Tony Spilotro is one of Las Vegas' most persistent. Not a literal ghost, of course, but a reminder of what the city once was and what it cost to become what it is today. The gleaming corporate casinos rose from the ashes of the mob-run joints. The regulated, sanitized gambling industry emerged from the chaos and violence of the skim era. In a perverse way, men like Tony Spilotro helped create modern Las Vegas by showing what it couldn't remain. Their violence and corruption became so blatant, so damaging, that legitimate business and government finally had to act. The mob's excesses led to its own destruction, and Tony's story is perhaps the perfect example of that self-destruction. He came to Las Vegas to protect the mob's interests and ended up destroying them through his recklessness. He was sent to maintain order and created chaos. He was supposed to keep a low profile and became one of the most notorious figures in the city. Every excess, every unauthorized murder, every news story about his activities brought more attention, more heat, more pressure on the entire operation. The Chicago outfit didn't kill Tony Spilotro because he was evil. They were all evil by any reasonable standard. They killed him because he was bad for business. His violence had become counterproductive. His affairs had become embarrassing. His legal troubles threatened to expose everyone. In the amoral calculus of organized crime, Tony had become a liability, and liabilities were eliminated. But here's the final, perhaps most important truth about Anthony Spilotro. His story isn't over. Every time a young person chooses violence over peace, every time someone decides that crime is the answer to poverty, every time fear is used as a tool of control, Tony Spilotro's story continues. He was not unique, not some aberration. He was a product of systems and circumstances that still exist. In cities across America, there are young Anthony Spilotros growing up right now. Children in poverty, surrounded by crime, seeing violence as strength and legitimate work as weakness. Some will make different choices, escape the cycle, but others will follow Tony's path, becoming both perpetrators and victims of violence, destroying others and ultimately themselves. This is why Tony Spilotro's story matters. Not as entertainment, not as a glorification of mob life, but as a warning. This is what violence creates. This is what choosing fear over love, crime over law, death over life leads to. A shallow grave in a cornfield, a widow trying to explain to her son who his father really was, dozens of victims whose names we'll never know, families destroyed across generations. As the sun sets over Las Vegas today, the city Tony once ruled glitters with a different kind of light. The neon still blazes, the money still flows, the dreams and schemes continue. But the brutal simplicity of Tony's era, solve problems with violence, take what you want, might makes right, has given way to something more complex, if not necessarily more honest. In the end, Tony the Ant Spilotro's life poses a question that each of us must answer. What are we willing to do for power, for money, for respect? How far will we go and what will we sacrifice? Tony answered those questions with violence, and violence answered him back, taking everything he had built, everything he loved, everything he was. His son Vincent said he wanted people to know his father was just a man. He was right. Tony Spilotro was just a man, not a monster from a nightmare, not a villain from central casting, but a human being who made terrible choices and paid a terrible price. That's what makes his story truly frightening. It shows us not what monsters can do, but what humans can become. And in that Indiana cornfield, where the Spilotro brothers were found buried in their underwear, beaten beyond recognition, there's a final lesson. No matter how much power you accumulate, no matter how much fear you inspire, no matter how untouchable you seem, violence has its own logic, its own momentum, its own inevitable conclusion. Tony Spilotro ruled Las Vegas with fear for 15 years, but in the end, fear ruled him too. The man who had made so many others disappear simply vanished himself, becoming just another casualty in the endless war of organized crime, another body in another unmarked grave, another reminder that those who live by violence will die by it too. Today, if you visit Las Vegas, you can take a mob tour. They'll show you where Tony lived, where he conducted business, where his crimes occurred. The tour guides will tell you stories, some true, some embellished, all designed to entertain tourists looking for a glimpse of the city's dark past. Tony Spilotro has become a commodity, his violence packaged and sold to visitors eating ice cream and taking selfies. But the real legacy of Anthony Spilotro isn't in the tour or the movies or the true crime books. It's in the empty chairs at dinner tables, the children who grew up without fathers, the families still dealing with trauma decades later. It's in his own son, still trying to reconcile the father he loved with the killer the world knows. It's in every young person who thinks violence is the answer, not knowing that violence always demands payment in full. The cornfield in Indiana where Tony and Michael Spilotro were buried has long since been harvested and replanted, in the eternal cycle of agriculture. The earth that briefly held their bodies shows no sign of the violence that brought them there. Nature has erased the physical evidence of their murders, but the emotional evidence, the psychological evidence, the spiritual evidence that remains. In the nightmares of those who knew them, in the grief of those who loved them, in the relief of those who feared them. Anthony Spilotro is gone, but the damage he did echoes through generations. This is the true horror of a life lived through violence. It doesn't end with death. The pain radiates outward through time, touching people who weren't even born when the crimes were committed. Vincent Spilotro's children, should he have them, will carry the weight of their grandfather's legacy. The grandchildren of Tony's victims will grow up in families shaped by loss. And somewhere in Chicago or Las Vegas or any other city where poverty and crime intersect, another young Anthony Spilotro is making his first choice toward violence. Another kid is learning that fear gets you respect, that violence gets you paid, that loyalty is negotiable and life is cheap. Another family is about to be destroyed, another community about to be traumatized, another cycle of violence about to begin. This is why we tell these stories, not to glorify or romanticize but to warn and remember. Tony the Ant Spilotro lived by violence and died by violence, ruled through fear and was destroyed by fear, built an empire on blood and watched it all wash away. In the end, standing in that basement in Bensonville facing his death, Tony Spilotro asked for one thing: a moment to pray. The killer wanted mercy, the torturer wanted compassion. The man who had shown no pity wanted one moment of grace, and in that moment perhaps he finally understood what all his victims had felt: the terror, the desperation, the profound loneliness of facing death. They say he prayed for his wife and son, not for salvation, not for forgiveness, not even for a quick death. He prayed for Nancy and Vincent, the only good things in a life built on evil. And then the baseball bats came down, and Anthony Spilotro's story ended the way it had to end, the way he had written it, with every choice he made, every life he took, every moment he chose violence over peace. But Nancy and Vincent's story continued. They had to wake up the next day and the day after that and all the days that followed, carrying the weight of Tony's life and death. They had to find a way to mourn a monster, to love a killer, to remember a man everyone else wanted to forget. This is the final cruelty of Anthony Spilotro's life. Even in death, he left others to pay for his choices. His violence didn't end when his heart stopped beating. It continued in the trauma of those who survived, in the grief of those who mourned, in the confusion of a son trying to understand his father. And perhaps that's the most important lesson of all. Violence is never just about the moment of impact. It's about everything that comes before and everything that comes after. It's about the choices that lead to that moment and the consequences that flow from it. It's about the cycles that create killers and the cycles that killers create. Tony, the Ant Spilotro was buried on June 27, 1986. But in a very real sense, we're still burying him today, still trying to understand him, still dealing with what he represented, still learning the lessons of his violent life and violent death. Still hoping that somewhere, someone will hear this story and choose differently, break the cycle, refuse the violence that consumed Tony Spilotro and everyone around him. Because if Tony's story teaches us anything, it's this. Violence is not strength, fear is not respect, power built on blood will always wash away. And in the end, when you're facing your own death, all the money you stole, all the people you killed, all the fear you inspired, none of it will matter. All that will matter is what you did to the people you loved and what you left behind in the world. Tony Spilotro left behind grief, trauma, and a cautionary tale written in blood. He left a widow and an orphan. He left dozens of victims and hundreds of lives destroyed. He left a legacy of violence that echoes through generations. And he left us with a choice: learn from his story or repeat it, choose peace or choose violence. Build up or tear down, love or fear, the choice is ours, it always has been. And somewhere, Anthony Spilotro's ghost is waiting to see what we decide.